good to be here. Thank you for having me. It was nice to get out of the house today. Um, this is the first time I've done an event outside of my home in over a year. When the pandemic hit, I think I had 10 or 15 events planned, all of which were canceled, and we're just sort of getting back into it now. And most of them by Zoom, and it is, for me, it's challenging at times. I'd rather have a live audience, but you go with what you have. Anyway, so thanks for having me. I'm going to actually read from my standalone novel that's coming out in June. Its title is Bonnie Jack, and the genesis of the book, my father's life, not in real terms, but in terms of inspiration. And I'm going to read the prologue from the book. It's not that long. Put my glasses on. This is a post-pandemic thing as well, the glasses. So the prologue to the book is set in Glasgow, Scotland, in November 19th. She sat in the cinema between her two children, her well-worn wool coat musty and damp from the rain. The children had thought they were going out to the shops, but to their delight, she had taken them to the Regal Cinema for the Saturday afternoon matinee. If we go in here, you can't tell your father about this. You have to promise me, their mother said, as they stood at the ticket window. I promise, the girl 9 and the boy 6 chorused. Cross your hearts, their mother said. Both children dutifully crossed their hearts. There were no ice creams or lollies for them, and they had to kneel on their seats to see past the heads that towered in front. But he didn't care, as they had John Wayne and Tim McCoy to entertain them. John came first in The Lucky Texan. It didn't matter to the children if he was a great actor. It was enough that he was a cowboy on the open range. What could possibly be more exotic to small children living in the Gorbals neighborhood of Glasgow, one of the most densely populated and poorest parts of the British Kingdom? When the first film ended, the mother said to her son, I have to take Moira to the loo. Will you be all right by yourself for 5 minutes? I'll be fine, Mummy, he said. She leaned over and kissed him on the forehead. I love you so much, she said. The Tim McCoy film began before his mother and his sister returned, and he was soon caught up in it. About halfway through, he realized they still hadn't come back. He wondered briefly where they were, but then thought perhaps his sister wasn't feeling well, and he returned to the movie. It wasn't until it ended and the people around him began to file out of the cinema that he felt a touch of fear. Still, he sat and he waited, sure his mother would come to get him when the aisles cleared. She didn't. He slumped in the seat, his head not visible above his back, and he began to cry. The cleaning staff discovered him as he swept up litter. Who brought you here? A woman asked. My mum. Where is she? She took my sister to the loo and she hasn't come back. I'm sure she'll be back soon enough, the woman said. His crying intensified. Laddie, I told you she'll be back. But she left after the John Wayne film, he said between sobs. The woman looked at him and then turned to speak to a woman working several rows in front. Sadie, look after this wee laddie for a few minutes. I need to go find his mum. The boy closed his eyes, tried to fight back the tears. Don't cry, the other woman said. We'll find your mum. Moira must be sick, he thought. But the woman didn't return, and he began to hear voices at the rear of the cinema. One of those voices was the cleaning woman's, and it kept saying, poor wee laddie. Tears floated again, and this time he gave into them completely. So that's the prologue to Bonnie Jack. And so the genesis was my father's life. My father was abandoned in a movie house in Scotland when he was that age. And he neglected to tell his family, including my mother and 3 children. He neglected to tell any of us until 50 years later. So 50 years later, we're at a family dinner, and out of the blue, my father says, "I have a sister." And it came as a bit of a shock to everyone. And he said, "I've been looking for her and I found her." And she was living in England, in Bristol. He and my mother went to see her, and she was a poverty-stricken spinster. And my father, having retained all of his Scotch habits, was afraid she'd hit him up for money, and there were no relationship ever developed. But while he was there speaking to her, she informed him he had 2 other siblings. His mother had been pregnant when she abandoned him, and later remarried and had another child. And he ended up connecting with both sisters. He ended up connecting with both of them, one of which didn't work out very well, but the other did. So that's sort of the basis of the story. Now I've changed my father, because he was a working class bricklayer. I've changed my father into the president of an insurance company in Boston, Massachusetts. And stories about his search with a long lost sister after he was abandoned. The book is called Bonnie Jack. I'm really nervous about how it's going to be received. My editor loves it, but then he's paid to. It's common enough for the literary writers to switch and write in the genre. Many of them have given it a go. It's not so usual for someone who's writing a genre to write a novel. And anyway, it looks like it's going to be reviewed extensively, and I just hope people are kind and that it has a good audience. So write the book down, Bonnie Jack, available beginning of June, and make a note to buy it, please. I'm still working, of course, on everything else. So Fortune, which was the 3rd Uncle book, came out in January. There's an Ava Lee scheduled to be released around Christmas time. It's called The Sultan of Sarawak. I've just signed a new 3-book contract with my publisher. So there will be actually now a 4th uncle, and yet another Ava, and then potentially sort of a whole new Ava uncle series going back in time close to 20 years. So I'm working on a lot of things at the same time. So I will be pleased to answer any and all questions, Debbie, about Ava, about uncle, about Anderson.
Give me 1 second. I'm just going to move to another room.
Okay.
And then we can. Hang on. Okay, I'm going into Laura's office. Okay. Everyone can hear me too?
My wife's actually attending by Zoom from our home in Burlington tonight, which makes me even more nervous than usual. But she's my sharpest critic. She's my best critic. My sharpest. So I have to be careful what I say.
Okay. So I have a question here, Ian. Hang on a second.
Maybe went to another room. There she is.
Oh, you know what? Hang on.
Okay, whatever. There's a question from Suzanne about to everyone that the next uncle, will it be a continuation? Yeah. No, I read it. I saw the.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So the plan was to write 3 uncles, and but as I was writing the 3rd, I began to talk to my editor because it seemed to me that I needed to close the circle, and so we talked, and I pitched the idea of writing a 4th uncle, which would be probably two novellas, back to back. One called First, and the second one called Final. And I wanted to write about how Uncle met Ava for the first time through his eyes. because in the Dragon of Hong Kong, you see it through her eyes. I want to do it through his eyes because it's a different experience. So that will be the first part of the book. And the second part of the book is going to be Uncle's last 3 months. I'm going to write about his last 3 months of his life up until his death, because it cements in really hard terms the relationship he had with Ava, and gets into it in detail. So that will be the fourth Uncle book. The next Ava book, which is out at Christmas, is called The Sultan of Sarawak. It's got a lot to do with illegal logging in Borneo, but the subplot is a continuation of the film that she decided to finance for Lau Lau, Pang Fei's ex-husband. That plot began in The Goddess of Yantai and has carried forth since then. So The Sultan of Sarawak will be out at Christmas, and that will be followed by a book called The General of Tiananmen Square, which will focus on the film they've made, its distribution, and the reaction of the Chinese government. So that's my current work schedule.
Ian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see the chat on the screen?
No, not right now.
Okay. So I'm not sure which one did you.
I read the one, Uncle being a continuation. Next Uncle book being a continuation.
There's one before that.
Okay.
How do you keep all your ideas straight in your head when you're planning all these books? I think we would all like to know that. I'm not sure if you have an answer to that.
I'd like to know it too. I was talking to Debbie earlier. So the way I work is typically I have a long story arc in my mind. I know where I'm going 2 or 3 books ahead, typically, right? And as long as I know that, then I'm in the process of working to get there. Okay. So if I have a story arc, I know where I want to end up with something, then sort of piecing it together to get there isn't terribly complicated. The tough part, of course, is if you don't know where you're going and you're just stumbling around. Okay, that's when plots go all over the place and bad things happen. And I don't know where it comes from, but I've always had these ideas come to me at random times that propel plots forward. When I sat down to write my first book, I mean, all I was trying to do was write a book. I wasn't thinking of writing 20 books. I was going to write a book and prove to myself I could do it. But as I was writing that first book, out of nowhere, a plot idea comes from a second book. So I built that plot idea into the first book and just then kept writing. And I'm writing the second book, and I realized I've got plots for a third and a fourth book. Okay. When I was writing the third book, I knew how the sixth book ended. Okay. In fact, I'd written the last 2 chapters in my head long before I even sat down at the typewriter or computer to do it. And it's that's always sort of been like that. And part of my process is that when I'm writing, I don't like to get bored. Okay. So if I'm writing about a character who doesn't really interest me or who is boring, I will ditch them. I'll write them right out. I want nothing to do with them. But then what happens, I get surprised by characters who I start to write about, and they may have a very minor part of the plot I'm working on, but they grab my interest, and I expand and grow their situation. Perfect example of that is Lau Lau. So when I was writing The Goddess of Yantai, and Pang Fei is having issues, and Ava's trying to help her, Ava and Pang Fei go to see Fei's ex-husband, Lau Lau, who had been a famous Chinese film director and was now a wreck of a human being, a completely messed up person. And he was only supposed to be part of one conversation in the book. He was a minor part of the plot. Okay, but as I'm writing her conversation with him, Ava's conversation, he becomes like totally interesting. And all of a sudden I realize Ava's fascinated with this guy and she's going to try to rehabilitate him. Okay. And that forms part of the plot of the next book. Okay. He goes to rehab, right? And then he writes a script. She finances a script. He writes a script. And that becomes part of the book after that. Okay. In the Sultan of Sarawak, they're actually shooting the movie in Taipei. So the movie is now in production. In the last book in the series, which is the General Tiananmen Square, the film is made and is being released in Cannes. So from that one little conversation, I had a storyline that took me through 3 or 4 books. And I don't know how it happens or where it comes from. It just does. But the key is not to be afraid to run with it. Not to be afraid to run with it. Just do it. Because I don't do outlines of books. I don't do detailed outline. I don't do any outlines, never mind a detailed outline. I sit and I write, and wherever the story and the characters take me, that's where I'm prepared to go. Next question, Debbie.
We have a question. It's a statement first. I've read every one of your books, most 2 times. Why did you die uncle?
Okay. So I didn't. So I'm writing the 3rd book. Okay. And just as these ideas come at me randomly, I'm writing the 3rd book and I realize Uncle's going to die at the end of the 6th book. Okay. So it's nothing I planned. It's there in my mind. He's going to die at the end of the 6th book. So just like I took the Lau Lau character and ran with that, I take Uncle's death and I run with his death. Okay. And but it was sort of, the way it happened was sort of left things unresolved, which led to the Uncle series, of course. Okay. I was telling Debbie, I have a new agent in the States, and she's convinced that after I finish this General of Tiananmen Square, between the novella, the Dragonhead of Hong Kong, and the first Ava novel, which is The Water Rat of One Child, there's a 10-year gap in time. And she wants me to go back and write a whole new series of Uncle and Ava books covering those 10 years of unexplored time. Okay. And I'm actually becoming very warm to the idea. I wasn't at first, but now I am. And I think there's probably a whole new series possible to come out of that. Whether we call it Ava Lee Redux or Retro, whatever we call it, but it's entirely feasible. I'm going to go there. So Uncle's death was unfortunate, but it was out of my hands completely. I go with the storyline, and where the storyline takes me, I go. And that's where it took me. And incidentally, the last 2 chapters I mentioned in book 6, the last 2 chapters were his funeral. So even when I'm writing book 3, I know about the funeral, right? And if you go back and you read book 3, I plant the seed of his death in that book. That's when the stomach problems start. Book 4, a little more detail. Book 5, it becomes obvious. Book 6, he dies.
Well, there are a lot of positive reactions. I saw a lot of smiles when you said that there was going to be another series and all these new books that you're planning. I've got a question from Mona. How much time do you spend writing? Has that changed since the pandemic hit?
When I started to write, it was it was like a fever. Okay. I have a very addictive personality, and when I started to write, I became addicted to writing. So I wrote the first 4 Ava Lee novels in 8 months. I've slowed down since then, although this year we're going to be publishing 3 books, so I haven't slowed down that much. So typically I'm in a 2-book-a-year schedule, and I don't find it onerous at all. I mean, it's for me something I love doing. I enjoy it very much, and I have no writing schedule, 0 writing schedule. I tend to write most days. Could be an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, but I don't do the all day things like I used to do. So I'm pacing myself better. Part of that may be because I'm actually probably writing better than I ever have been. So I'm not having to do as much rewriting as I did before, which saves me some time. But yeah, I write every day. I probably write 7 days a week. Could be a bit, half an hour here, an hour there, 2 hours here, 2 hours there. But when I'm writing a book, the plot line gets into my head and I cannot get rid of it. So I walk every day, and when I'm walking, the plot is going through my mind, okay? And I'm rewriting stuff as I walk. When I'm driving, it's the same thing. I'm always thinking of the book. I go to bed at night, thinking about what I wrote. And I found out, I didn't know, I had this, it's not an ability, I don't know what you'd call it, but I could, when I go to bed at night, I could remember what I wrote. I could edit it in my head or rewrite it in my head. And the next morning, remember it all when I sat down at the computer. I didn't have to make notes or anything like that. So, yeah.
Okay, next one. Just reading The Diamond Queen of Singapore, enjoying the references to Toronto, Richmond, and Niagara on the Lake. How did you decide to make the home in Canada?
When I started to write the first book, I said, I don't do outlines, okay? I also don't do character studies, which some writers do. When I started to write the first Ava, I started with 1 sentence in my mind. That's all I had, was 1 sentence. And I had Ava, okay? And she came to me absolutely 100% fully formed, okay? I don't know how. I mean, I'm not being cynical. I did not make a list of names or try to pick a name. Just the name was in my head. Okay, her name is Ava Lee, and this is who she is. This is where she lives, and this is her life. And I knew it all. I knew everything about her, and that's how I started. So the fact she was living in Toronto was just part of who she was when she came to me, right? And her mother was in Richmond Hill, which made perfect sense to me, okay, et cetera, right? And her mother was the second wife, was a second wife, of which Toronto's full of them, you know. A lot of the private schools in Toronto wouldn't have students if it wasn't for second wives. They're quite insistent that their kids get the best education and make their husbands pay for it. So.
When you talk about your writing process, it sounds like you meet the characters and they take you into their lives and you follow where they lead. Does it feel like that to you? I'm in no way minimizing the work involved.
No, they are real people to me. Okay? They are real. And one of the things I try to do when I write is to make my stories and my characters entirely plausible. Okay? Which means your characters can't be one-dimensional. Okay, there has to be inconsistencies in their life. Okay, one of the things I enjoyed about writing with Ava was that I could grow her life. You watch her as she gets older, she changes, you know, the way she operates changes, the way she thinks changes, okay? She's becoming more mature, more professional, everything about her keeps growing and changing. And that was really deliberate on my part, okay? When I realized I was gonna write a series, one of the dangers of writing a series, well, there are 2 dangers. One is you tell everything there is to know about your character in the first 10 or 20 or 30 pages of a book. There's nothing left for a reader to discover. Okay? And I didn't want to do that. I wanted things to sort of dribble out here and there, so you kept learning more and more and more and more and more. I mean, there is the suggestion early on that Uncle's triad. That's never really confirmed until book 4. That's when it becomes certain. You know, he was a triad, you know. But until then, like there are doubts, okay. And again, that was very deliberate on my part. The second danger when you're writing series is to start repeating the same plot over and over again. Okay? And I didn't want my books to be static. I wanted them to keep changing. And that meant characters had to change, which meant partially Uncle had to die, right? And that Pang Fei had to, and that Maria Gonzalez had to leave, and Pang Fei come in, right? And readers' reaction is really interesting. A lot of people were happy when Eva and Maria split for some reason. A lot of people didn't like Maria Gonzalez, and I don't know why, because I thought she was lovely. She wasn't up to Eva's speed, perhaps, but I thought she was lovely. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question or not, Tim.
At this time, we don't have anything else in the chat window, but we are open if you have a question that you'd like to ask via just in person, that's fine. You can unmute yourself and ask something. Is anyone interested? Mona, do you have your hand up? Go ahead, Mona.
Yes. Yeah. So I know you mentioned it at the beginning, but normally when I attend the Wine and Words, I always purchase books from the authors. And so can you just even maybe put it in the chat where we can buy the upcoming books and the dates? So you mentioned, I think, a place in Niagara-on-the-Lake where we could buy them, right?
I had mentioned a store in St. Catharines called somedaybooks.ca. It's on King Street. I generally send a follow-up email when the YouTube video has been posted, so for your interest, and I can include that as well.
Thank you. Okay.
We got a couple more questions here. Hang on a second. Let me just pull up my chat. How did you research the Hong Kong triads?
How did I research the Hong Kong triads? I always knew a little bit about them. And I had a friend who had an association with them at one point. So I knew about the debt collection business through him and how it operated and what the rates were, et cetera, et cetera. For the rest of it, I did quite a bit of reading about the triads, and there's an amazing amount of information available. Because, I mean, it's a 400 or 500 year old society, and which actually originated in China as a political group. They formed to fight against an evil emperor, sort of. And when they were successful, ventured off into other things. Some of them formed labor unions or trade guilds, and some obviously went into crime. But there is a lot of literature available. And one of the Uncle books I write about the initiation rite, and that's well documented. The 36 oaths are documented. I mean, there is a lot of information available. I end up romanticizing it a bit, of course. And I make sure Uncle is a triad gang leader, never does anything totally rotten or unethical. You know, he prefers to dabble in victimless crimes. Although I guess there are people who wouldn't think that making knockoff clothing or knockoff hardware was victimless, but it never bothered me when I bought it, so I have to say. Someone asked a question about how do I know there's a book coming out at Christmas?
Yes. I was just about to read that. Go ahead.
The book is written. I tend to work, I'm usually a year to 2 years ahead in terms of finishing books. So the book coming out at Christmas, I sent the manuscript to my editor last December, and we've done the first round of editing. There will be a second and a third round, but the book will be out at Christmas. The fourth uncle book, which I would think will be out in the summer of 2022. I'm halfway through it now, in terms of writing it. And I expect to be finished by May with that book. So I try to work like a year ahead. Less stressful that way. I'm not trying to meet deadlines, just internal deadlines.
Anyone else have a question to ask? Sometimes it's hard for me to see, so you're welcome to just unmute and ask away. I've got one for you.
Okay.
I think the last time you were here, you mentioned about having people have bought the TV rights to your books, or to many of them, in fact. Is that something that's still being worked on, or?
That is in a state of flux right now. The people who had the option, and they're really very good people, also we're working with stuff like Kim's Convenience, et cetera, et cetera. And we ended up not renewing the option. So I have a new agent. So I'm working with ICM out of New York and Los Angeles, and they're in the process of placing the books again. There is interest and there are offers. I don't know where it's going. It has been a very long and complicated and frustrating process, I have to say. It's a different world when you're trying to do TV and film. And the further I remove from it, I'm beginning to think the better off it'll be for me. I'll let them go do their thing, and I'll just mind my business and stay in the basement and keep writing.
I think everyone would appreciate that. Anyone else have anything? Ev, are you waving? Do you have another question, or are you just waving?
I wasn't waving, but I do have a question. Just about the Bonnie Jack book. You mentioned that it was sparked by your father's revelation that the family hadn't known for 50 years. Is it then based on the events that actually happened, or do you take it somewhere else?
I take it totally somewhere else.
Yeah, okay. It was just that was the spark.
Yeah, I mean, that was the spark. And then my character, whose name is Jack Anderson, I think it was supposed to, I don't know how I came up with the name. It couldn't have been more boring. His wife's name is Ann Anderson, which is as boring. But anyway, the story is about him trying to reconcile being left in a movie house at that age. Okay. He wants to understand why it happened. Okay. And he's got all this blame for his mother, of course, right? And it's about him searching, find answers. He finds the sister, and when he sees the sister, she turns out to be as disappointing as my father's sister was to him. Okay, but it informs him that he has twin siblings because his mother was pregnant when she abandoned him. So again, there's a similarity. But when he meets the siblings, the story just takes off. Okay, because they're a very interesting family. There's all kinds of complications, and they've actually located their father, and that ends up being a terrible confrontation. And what I loved about the way the book developed was when the book starts, the wife, Ann Anderson, is a stay-at-home woman living in Wellesley, Mass. She spent her whole life looking after the kids and the house. And he's built this fabulously successful career. His nickname is Bloody Jack Anderson, and in the business world. And so you got this guy who thinks he's in charge of everything and everyone, okay? And as they go to Scotland to look for the family and meet the family, and things start to move and shift and change, all of a sudden, all of his weaknesses as a human being start to become apparent, and all of her strengths as a human being start to become apparent. And they almost, by the end of the book, reverse roles, where all of a sudden he finds himself dependent on this woman, and she's looking at him through totally different eyes than she was before. And that's what I love about the book.
Thank you.
And I think you had a question.
Gwen had a question.
Oh, hello. It's not Gwyn, it's Sue. It's Sue. But I'm interested in, it says Gwyn up there, yes.
Yeah, I see that. That's a
That's
good
my
Welsh
husband.
name. It's a good
It is a good
Welsh
Welsh
name.
name. Yes, he's Welsh, yes.
Yeah, I was born in Wales, so
Oh, really? Where?
Chirk.
I don't know, okay.
Okay.
He's from Brecon, but we have a daughter called Kindwell, which causes all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
You obviously do, a lot of your books require a lot of research, for example, on the Triads, also on the fashion industry, diamond industry. I just wondered what percentage of your time you spend on research versus actually writing. And it sounds as though you must be doing research while you're writing one book, you must be doing research for the next book.
I do an amazing lack of research. Okay, because I'm not, it's when I write about a place like Singapore or Borneo or Georgetown, Guyana. I'm not interested in writing a travelogue. I want to give my reader a sense of the flavor of the place. Okay, so I typically pick out one or two really strong things that hit me when I was in those places, and I focus on them. Similarly, I knew a little bit about the diamond trade, but when I research it, I'm researching it to find things that really interest me about it, rather than all the nitty gritty. Okay, so I'm trying to pick out highlights, things that interest me and hope interest my readers. I probably did more research for the Diamond Queen than any book I've done, because I was also writing with opioids and stuff like that. But for most of the books, there's not a lot of research. Some of them are based on real life events, for example. So I knew of them and just adapted them to a novel form. So yeah. I should
Ian,
do more,
can you
probably.
hear me?
Hey, Ashok, yes.
Ian, if I recall, you had mentioned previously in one of your visits here that you didn't want to bring any politics into your books because you didn't want to date the books.
Yes.
But you have said that you're going to be bringing more politics into your books. And there's a lot happening in China, obviously.
Yeah.
Which book are you really bringing more politics in?
The General of Tiananmen Square will be very political. And actually, if you read the third uncle book, Fortune, is very political. It's a very political book because it deals with the real life fact that the Chinese Communist government cut a deal with the Triads pre-handover for the Triads to, in effect, become their paramilitary on the ground in Hong Kong. And that's what's happened. So if you think back to the demonstrations in Hong Kong a year ago, 18 months ago, when the demonstrators were being attacked, not by troops, but by supposedly civilian groups, the civilian groups were Triads, working at the behest of the Chinese government. So the communists and the Triads are now in bed together, and in terms of Hong Kong and probably elsewhere. And what was interesting was I went back and I found an actual quotation from the guy who was the Minister of Public Security for China. I think it was 1993. It's in the book, the quote, where he says, I'll bore you with it if you don't mind. Okay, as always, I can never find it when I need it. Okay, so this is an actual quotation from Tao Leger, sorry, from Tao Siju, who was the Minister of Public Security for the People's Republic of China. And he was in Hong Kong, and he was giving a press conference. And he said, triads are not always gangsters. As long as they're patriotic, as long as they're concerned about Hong Kong's prosperity and stability, we should treat them with respect and we should unite with them. And that's really kind of a remarkable statement. I found that through research, by the way. So the Emperor of Tiananmen Square is going to be about suppression of film, suppression of free speech, the way that the government tries to manipulate and control all of the messages and all the messages. And it's going to focus on that. I don't know. And Ava is going to, so they're going to make this film. The film is called Tiananmen, and it's about the massacre in Tiananmen Square and what caused it, what happened. And the Chinese, in China today, you cannot find any reference to that event. It's been purged from everything. You can't find it online. You can't find it in any literature. It's been totally purged. As far as the Chinese government is concerned, it never happened. Okay, and anyone who suggests it did is crushed. Okay, so the idea that Ava and her gang have made this film about Tiananmen Square, the massacre in Tiananmen Square, would cause havoc in China. They've done it by financing it secretly. They've shot it secretly. They've done all kinds of things. But now they're going to actually present it to the world, and they're going to launch it at the Cannes Film Festival. Okay, and the film naturally is going to be fantastic, and very well received. But the backlash is going to be humongous. Backlash is going to be humongous, and unknown to most of us is the fact that many of the Hollywood studios are now financed by Chinese money. Okay, so in terms of it's one thing to make a film, it's another thing to get it distributed, and in my book, the Chinese government will do everything they can to prevent the film ever being seen anywhere. So it's how Ava and the gang try to work their way around it, manipulate it, and Hong Kong will be part of it, because Ava's going to actually arrange to rent a cinema in Hong Kong for one night and show the film with an invited list of guests. So anyway, that's all sort of in my head right now. I haven't worked it through completely, but that's a couple of books down the road.
I have a question in chat from Cindy.
Yeah.
Is it possible to dive into any one of your Ava Lee series, or does one need to start at the beginning to have a grounding with the characters?
I write them all as standalones, so the stories stand on their own. Okay, and I try not to dump too much backstory into the books as they go. It's better to start with book one. It's always better, I think, to start with book one. But I think you can actually leap in anywhere and have an enjoyable read. I think so. The one, if you haven't read them yet, one warning: they are addictive. Okay, you read one, you're going to read 14. I hope. At least that's what I've been told.
I think I can back you up on that based on people borrowing books and always asking for the next one. So you are correct. Anyone else have a question? Oh, I have this is going back to our TV conversation. It's a bit of a fun exercise, Ian.
Yeah.
Who would you pick to portray Ava in a movie or TV show?
Okay, so when I was doing the first contract with producers, I said there are two ways to approach film and TV, right? Elmore Leonard famously, simply sold the rights to his book and said, do what you want. I never want to look at it again. So he totally ignored the entire process, okay? You get other writers who become obsessed with having control, okay? They always end up depressed, okay? So I'm leaning now towards the Elmore Leonard vote. But in terms of casting, I always said three things. I said, I want whoever plays Ava to be Chinese Canadian. Okay. Okay. I do not want her sexuality changed. And thirdly, I do not want her family structure changed. If you leave those three things intact, okay, I'm happy basically with whatever else you want to do. But those are the things that really matter to me. And the thing about the Chinese Canadian is that Westerners tend to look at Asians and not make a distinction between Korean Canadian, Japanese Canadian, Chinese Canadian, okay, Filipino, Thai, okay. They sort of all kind of look the same. I know that sounds, I don't mean that to be racist or anything, but like, and these people are all very sensitive about their own nationality, their own culture, and their own everything. And if you hire, people have said to me, oh, Sandra Oh would be a terrific Ava. She's Korean, Canadian. She would offend so many people just by the fact she's Korean, Canadian. You know? It just doesn't work. It's like getting a Swede to play an Italian or something like that. You know, it doesn't translate very well. But those are the things that matter to me. It has to be young too, obviously, right? You can't have a 45-year-old playing. He's so young. Luckily, there are a lot of good young Chinese Canadian actresses. Many of them working in Hong Kong. So they are there. My dream was always that we'd hire an unknown to play Ava. I'd like an unknown to play Ava, and then surround her with a cast of really well-known veteran Chinese actors and actresses. That would be sort of my dream cast.
Anyone else?
Hi, Sashok here again. I think I'd mentioned this to you once, Ian. You've got a wonderful Hong Kong actor, Chow Yun-fat, who could play uncle, especially at his age now.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Chow Yun-fat.
I know Chow Yun-fat, and he's always been on my list, but he's always been on my list for her father, is Marcus Lee. I've always seen Chow Yun-fat as being Marcus Lee. Okay. And so he is a wonderful actor. I doubt we could afford him, so.
That could be possible.
Yeah.
It's been a great evening. Does anyone else have any other questions? This has been, you never disappoint. Our audiences never disappoint, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And
Yeah.
I appreciate the support. Now remember, Bonnie Jack's out in June. I want you not only to buy it or read it, but also say nice things about it, please.
I don't think you're gonna have to worry with this crowd. I think you've won them over.
Thank you.
I'm gonna say thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure having you on my screen, and hopefully I've seen some of you in person, and hopefully we will continue to do that. Fingers crossed. Ian, thank you very much
My
for coming
pleasure.
again. And the invitation is always open for every one of your books. You're welcome to come and launch them here. We'll see you, every 6 months?
Yes, sure. Thank you.
Um,
Lorraine, I'll be home in about an hour.
Yeah. Hi, Lorraine. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet
Lorraine-
you. Thank you for joining us.
Lorraine is my first reader. She reads everything first. And
Well-
I value her judgment tremendously. So.
So then she has a very definite hand in all of this. Thank you very much.
She's a big role, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting him come all the way down here. And he'll be back in about an hour.
An hour or so, yeah.
Yep. To the rest of you, have a good night. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Goodbye,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.